Good evening, everyone. My name is Prem Shankar Jha. I am a journalist and I'm 81 years old, and I have covered events in India for the last 55 years. I would like first to thank the editors of The Wire for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all on the single most threatening crisis that our nation has faced since it was born. This, as you all know, is the COVID crisis. Someone sent me a Twitter feed the other day. In it, a young man is saying in Thet Punjabi, in America, Donald Trump has told everyone, take 1 month's salary and stay home. But our Prime Minister has opened a new bank account and has asked us to put our money into it. This one observation reflects the lack of trust in the government's capacity to steer India through this crisis that has begun to surface in the country. Mr. Modi's suggestion that we should all light candles and observe a 9-minute silence at 9 p.m. at night on April 5th only strengthens the fear that the government is at its wit's end. If this feeling takes hold, then the population will soon feel that it is every man for himself, and all semblance of law and order will come to an end. A great deal of damage has already been done, most of it the result of haste, a lack of foresight, and a tendency that this government has shown more than once in the past 6 years of not looking where it is going before it leaps. But this damage is not irreparable, because COVID is not an airborne virus that attaches itself to a molecule of oxygen or nitrogen to travel from one person to another. It travels in the humidity exhaled by the lungs when a person breathes out or coughs. It can therefore be directly inhaled only over a short distance. Hence the emphasis on social distancing, which is keeping at least 6 feet away, wearing a mask, and washing your hands. This washing of your hands becomes important because globules of moisture that land on a hard surface can survive on it for anything from a few minutes to several hours. That is why washing hands, but especially using a sanitizer, is highly advised. Instructions to do all this regularly were issued by the government, as in other countries, as early as February, but they were not taken seriously. But even if they had been, it is unlikely that they would have made any difference, because as we are now finding, the principal conduit for the spread of the virus is the centralized air conditioning systems of aircraft and ships, and on land, the centralized air conditioning systems and heating systems that are found everywhere in the rich nations and are increasingly now being found in the cities of India also. Most of the outbreaks of COVID in India have been traced to people who have flown in from abroad. In Indian cities, central heating is entirely absent, almost entirely absent, but air conditioning is not. In addition to weddings, large social gatherings, and conferences, factories, upscale offices, malls, cinema halls, restaurants, and hotels are now routinely air conditioned. So these have become our new potential hotspots for the transmission of the virus. Another source which has only recently come to light is mass religious gatherings, like the one that occurred in Nizamuddin on March 11th and 12th, before any restrictions had been put in place by the government, and which have continued on a smaller scale in churches and temples despite the ban. Only a total lockdown, therefore, could have closed them all at the same time. That was the logic behind Prime Minister Modi's action. It would have worked like a dream if only the other consequences of a lockdown had been thought through first and neutralized. That is what the Modi government has failed to do. By far the most important of these is the impact of a lockdown upon the economy. The key feature of a lockdown is that it breaks the vertical and horizontal links, transport links, that are the warp and weft of the market economy. That is to say, the vertical and horizontal connections of production and consumption of the market economy. If the government does not simultaneously ensure that these connections are not broken, even though they are not in use, then first consumption and then production will grind to a halt. If the rupture gets prolonged, then the market economy itself withers away. The way to keep the market economy alive is to keep the sinews of that economy in good health. The sinews are its factories, shops, airlines, and road and rail transport companies, its malls, its theatres, its restaurants. In fact, every productive enterprise there is in the country needs to be kept alive, because the lockdown is an act of government, or if you like, an act of God. It is not something for which they can be blamed, and therefore they must not be held accountable. That is the most basic principle in dealing with the lockdown today. This requires meeting the fixed costs that these enterprises will incur even when their doors are shut, so that they don't go broke. In a shop, for instance, the main fixed costs are rent and the interest and amortization of the loans that the owner takes in order to stock his shelves. In factories and transport companies, it is the interest and amortization on long-term debt as well as on working capital, and the cost of maintaining the capital assets that you have, your machines and so on, so that they can start working immediately once the lockdown is lifted. But the most important and vulnerable asset of any company is its labor. No employer willingly fires a good worker, but if he is earning nothing and the government has not offered to meet even his fixed costs, then he has no option but to lay his workers off. That is what has been happening in India on a scale of millions today. For residents domiciled in the cities where they work, this is a serious loss. But for migrant workers, it is a catastrophe. That is what the lockdown has done to them. It has, in effect, I hope I'm not being too dramatic, but it is like a kiss of death. For them, it has been demonetization all over again, with the huge difference that in December 2016, they were able to go home on buses and trains. Today, they no longer have trains and buses to go home on. So, in the throes of utter desperation, they have decided to walk home, no matter how far it is and how long it takes. What has followed is an epic march of millions, whose only parallel that I can think of is what has come to be known as the death march of Armenians from Turkey to Syria and Lebanon in 1919, after the end of the First World War. In the past 10 days, 15 days, tens of thousands of workers and their families, many with little children, have been trekking anything from 80 to 1800 kilometers to their homes under the blazing sun of an approaching summer. It is not the state that has kept them alive on the way, at least not entirely, but the charity of ordinary Indians, themselves economic victims of the lockdown. That is something that we should all be proud of. That is actually true dharma. The most harrowing story, which many of you may have read, is of 120 desperate migrants who, with no one to turn to and nowhere else to go, began trekking 1,830 kilometers from Bengaluru to their homes in Barmer, Rajasthan. After they had trekked 600 kilometers, they were intercepted by the Gujarat police at Vapi on the state border, shoved into 2 airless cargo containers and driven 40 kilometers, not towards the Rajasthan border, but back into Maharashtra and then dumped on the road as they were on the point of suffocating to death. The migrants were rescued only because one of them had the contact number of a labour organisation of Rajasthan, the Ajivika Bureau, which informed the State Labour Commissioner, who in turn alerted the Maharashtra police. By March 31st, the state governments had intercepted 2.3 million returning migrants, checked and quarantined them. But no one knows how many more are on the road or have already reached their villages. The number has to be in lakhs, if not millions. The cat is therefore truly out of the bag. COVID has reached the villages. Can the harm that the virus can do still be contained? I believe the answer is yes, and this is because of 4 characteristics of the virus. First, unlike the Spanish flu, COVID is a vapor and spittle-borne virus. I have explained this already. Second, the mortality rate in COVID is low. It began by being 2% in China and rose to 3% for the world as a whole and 2.8% for India by the end of last month. A recent exhaustive assessment of China's COVID experience has shown that 94% of the 86,000 infected people there recovered on their own, and 81% did so being given only paracetamol. This shows that you really need to concentrate only on the most vulnerable segments of the population. That vulnerable section is the old and the very old. Very, very few people below the age of 60 have died if they have not already been suffering from a predisposing ailment. The death rate climbs among older patients because of the prevalence of other diseases, notably diabetes, hypertension, chronic gastrointestinal and pulmonary diseases, the most obvious of these being smoking. Fourth and finally, 80% or more of those who contract the disease recover on their own, many without knowing that they ever had it. Needless to say, the vast majority of those who do so are young people. There is an enormously important conclusion to be drawn from this. The migrant workers who are trekking homewards are all young, they are used to hard work, they are fit and they are hardy. They are therefore the last people we need to worry about dying from COVID. They may die on the way of heat stroke or thirst or exhaustion, but they shall not die of COVID-19, I beg your pardon. However, it is their parents who are at risk and need to be segregated when their sons and daughters arrive back in the village. In 2016, the population above the age of 65 numbered just under 100 million, of whom 2/3 lived in the villages. Since there are 593,000 inhabited villages in the country, this means that there are about 100 people on an average in each village who need to be specially looked after. Government, the local administration, the village administration now has ample capacity to do so. All they need to do really is to segregate the parents from the returning children. If this is done, then the returned migrants, after being quarantined for a while, can be put back to work straight away on the fields. Nowhere is safer in a village than the open fields, and that is where a bumper paddy crop and a plethora of fruits and vegetables are waiting to be harvested and in danger of rotting. If this is done, then, that is to say, if the segregation of the old from the young is done in every family, then the returned migrants can be put back to work straight away in the fields. The government's lack of foresight has already done great harm in pockets of the country. The entire first blush tea crop of Darjeeling, which is prized all over the world, has been destroyed, causing a loss of 1,500 crores of rupees to the owners and the workers. The second blush crop is also headed the same way. Soon, the mango crop, which is India's staple cash crop, and one of the major exports all over the world, will start to ripen. The lockdown in the villages must end before that happens. The returning migrants can not only help to bring these crops in more quickly, but earn some of the income they were forced to forego because of the lockdown. Here, therefore, are the bare bones of a policy to contain the spread of COVID. First, quarantine the returning migrants, then encourage them to look for work and segregate their parents. Second, keep the mandis open, but allow access to them only to those who are under 50 or at most under 60, and let the returned migrants take their place while the government compensates the older people for their temporary loss. Third, for those who begin to show signs of being infected, open camps right there beside the village where they can rest and get the food, water and medicine that eases the symptoms and helps them to conserve their strength. That is really all you need. As for intensive monitoring and medical care, it is not the returning migrants that require the sustained attention of the local government, but their parents and a limited number of children, nephews and nieces. These are the vulnerable groups on whom every block, anchal and village administration, every primary health center and every district hospital must focus its attention now. In the cities and industrial centers, a different strategy needs to be adopted. Small and medium enterprises in the manufacturing and services sectors, capital-intensive enterprises such as airlines, bus transport companies, and centrally air-conditioned shopping malls, theatres and hotels, and most of the country's 40 million kirana shops will need to be kept closed for a good bit longer, as the risk of transmission in them is particularly high. To make sure that they don't become insolvent and incapable of revival when the threat from COVID wanes, they will need to have their fixed costs and met by the government. These are rent and interest on the premises, on the shop premises, and on the loans that the shopkeepers have taken to stock their shelves. And in the case of companies, of industrial enterprises, it will be the interest on debt, long-term debt, on the amortization of that debt, and the maintenance of their capital equipment while it is not in use. Finally, the labor that is domiciled in its place of work has not tried to return to villages also needs to be protected so that it can come back to work immediately the moment the threat of COVID has passed. The way to do this is to keep paying them 2/3 of their salary or thereabouts during the duration of the lockout. Raman seems to be. This may seem like a freebie giveaway. It is nothing of the kind. This is the blood that will have to be transfused into the economy to keep it alive and in working condition. Other countries understand this and have thrown their account books away. Our government hasn't done that. Some idea of how far behind the Modi government's understanding is may be judged from the following data. Malaysia is pouring 17% of its GDP into keeping its economy alive. Britain is putting in 14%, France 13%. The US has put in $2 trillion, which is 11% of its GDP, because the USA's GDP is 37% of the GDP of the whole world. Germany is putting in 10% of its GDP. India, by contrast, has committed so far only 0.8% of its GDP to keeping its workers and its economy alive. That is simply not enough.